I'm a big fan of the poet S. Omar Barker from Las Vegas, New Mexico. Barker was born in 1894, died in 1985, and he's considered one of the classic cowboy poets. He was quite a character. His full name was Squire Omar Barker, which made his initials S.O.B. And Barker had the idea to turn that S on its side for his cattle brand to make it the lazy S.O.B. But he went to register the brand, and as Barker said, some other lazy S.O.B. had beat me to it. Barker wrote a lot of poems that I enjoy reciting, and I thought this one would be a good choice in honor of my guest on today's episode. This is The Grand Canyon Cowboy by S. Omar Barker. I'd heard of the canyon, the old cowboy said, and figured I'd like to go see it. So I rode till I spotted a rim out ahead, and I figured that this place must be it. Well, I anchored my horse to a juniper limb and crawled to the edge for a peek. One look was aplenty for to make my head swim and all my innards feel weak. If I'd known how darn deep it was going to be, I'd have managed by some hook or crook to tie myself to the doggone tree and let my horse go take the look. Howdy folks, this is Andy Hedges, and you're listening to Cowboy Crossroads. Each episode I'll interview a different guest and ask them to share stories and discuss music, poetry, and culture from the working cowboy west and beyond. My guest today is Ross Knox. Ross is a working cowboy, mule packer, and a poet. Ross has worked on big outfits across the West, performed at countless cowboy poetry gatherings, and packed mules into the Grand Canyon for over 15 years. I sat down with Ross in Amarillo, Texas during the WRCA World Championship Ranch Rodeo, and we had a nice visit. We tried to find a quiet little corner to do this interview, and it turned out to be a noisy little corner, so I apologize for the background noise that you might hear. But we still had a great time, and I hope you enjoy Ross's stories. Here's Ross Knox.
I left home when I was 16. I quit school. At that time, I figured for every day I stayed in school was a day I wasn't learning something. So I headed to Elko, Nevada, which is, of course, where the big outfits were at the time that I knew about, and went to work first at the IL ranch. I called Fred Vignolia, who was the manager of the IL, and caught the mail stage to Tuscarora. I spent a year or so, well, I didn't spend quite that long. I left there, went to the YP, and then I went to Wyoming, which was the first time I ever packed. I'd heard about Yellowstone and that country from a guy that came to work at the YP when I was there. I was just a kid, and I thought, man, I need to be looking at that country. So I headed north in the spring. I had no idea where it was even at. I figured if I went north far enough, I'd bound to find it. And I went to work for Clover Outfitters, George Clover, packing into Yellowstone and for 12-day trips. And it was pretty cool. I'm 18, or just dang near 18. And we would start up the South Fork of the Buffalo River, follow that till we hit the South Fork of the Yellowstone, and follow that till we hit the Continental Divide. And when you're 18, we're going out for 12 days. That's pretty cool stuff. I mean, anybody else my age is in a classroom.
When you grew up, did you grow up around cows and horses and cowboying?
We had a little cow outfit in Eastern Oregon, yes. But, and I thought I knew a little bit. but it was really very small scale compared to those big outfits. And I was telling somebody, I realized pretty quick I was so green I could hide in the lawn. You know, I mean, it was you know, you go from a 365 head cow outfit to 7,000 head of mother cows. Things are a little different, you know. And of course, we had a little ma and pop place, and the first cow outfit I went to work for, there was an 8-man crew, and I was just a button, you know. I was just a green kid. I didn't have a name. I was just button this and button that. It's so yeah, it was a real eye opener for me. I talked to Jay Harney, one of the greats who died here a couple of years ago now, I guess. And because we hit that country at kind of the same time, and it was the beginning of the end, and we didn't know it. And I'm so fortunate for that. So fortunate I quit school and got there when I did, because it wasn't very long and things started downhill.
What year would that have been?
1973 was, I was in Arizona when cow prices absolutely fell out of the bottom. Steer calves, I believe, went to 58 cents a pound, heifer calves to 53. And even as a kid, I could see them big changes were going to have to come. It took a couple of years, you know, for a lot of these outfits to really feel the effect, but it was going to happen, and they did. And you know, they stayed down for years and years, and finally started climbing back up out of the gutter. But yeah, it was changing for a lot of outfits went under. The outfits I was looking for, they were going to be able to sustain those bigger ranches. You know, they could kind of hold together. Lots of reasons, because they had other assets other than cows. I've always contended that the best way to make a small fortune in the cow business is to start with a large one. But, you know, so you better have something to fall back on, and many of the bigger ones did. So they were able to hold out. But it put a lot of people under. It put a lot of good men underground. You'll never see the wagons the way they were, the chuck wagons. You know, I worked at Circle A Ranch at Paradise Valley, Nevada. The last year, Matador Cattle Company had at least Matador out of Texas. And they ran 2 wagons there. And I worked on a lot of wagons and loved them. Now, by the time fall hit, I was just as ready as everybody else was to pull it back in. But those days are gone, and that's, you know, I went to California, and I see I see everybody unloading 4-wheelers out of the back of their trailers, you know, and things like that, which just sickens me. But nothing I can do about it. I just heard the Diamond A's, Northern Arizona, sent somebody to school to learn to fly a helicopter. That was a little unheard of 30 years ago. You know, it was, it was lean out over the brow band and strike a trot to the backside. But also, it's hard to find, you know, it's not all the cow outfit's fault. It's hard to find guys that'll do that anymore, too. There's not that many coming on that I can see. And there's a few, but not the magnitude that there was. So, you know, you can't always blame the rancher for the change either. You got to have the kids coming, and there's no money in it. You know, I mean, I went to work for the YP ranch, and I was just a teenager for sure, for $225 a month, and my room and board. That was just fine with me, because I didn't need any money. I was married. I left Simplot in Idaho. I was working at the only feedlot I ever worked in. My first wife was a beautician by trade. She had a good trade built up, a good clientele. She was making good money. Mike Landis called me from the Double O Ranch. I hated that feedlot. He called me from the Double O Ranch at Seligman, Arizona, and offered me a camp called the H's Camp for $500 a month in my groceries. And I never even talked to my wife about it. I just took it. Man, she was mad, But money didn't mean anything, and that doesn't seem to be the case anymore. Everybody's, trying to secure their future, and good for them. To me, the future was making it from the fall wagon to the spring wagon. And so, yeah, it was...
How'd you get from working those kind of outfits to packing mules in the Grand Canyon?
I went to Grand Canyon because I needed the insurance. I was going to have an open heart surgery, and I knew it. I've known it since I was a teenager. I had a valve that was leaking, and they said, one day, this is going to have to be fixed. And that day was coming. And I was in my early 30s. I was in great shape, but that valve was going bad, and I needed insurance. So, and I started packing mules, and I loved it. I loved the danger of it, which at Grand Canyon, I was there for 16 years. They flew me out of there 3 times. I don't know how many of my crew I was running it. I don't know how many of my crew I flew out of there over the years. But because when things go, there ain't much margin for error there. When things go bad, they go really bad. So it'll go down probably as the greatest place ever was. And that'll be one of the main reasons for it. It's just a dangerous place.
Yeah.
And I liked it.
You worked with Larry McWhorter in the Grand Canyon, didn't you?
I was packing and he was wrangling dudes. Larry lived with me there for a long time. He'd just gone through a divorce, and he was in a pretty bad way. We were friends, very good friends, and he called me up. And I told him, I says, get out here now. I said, I want you to be here in 48 hours, and we can get you a job. And he did. He loaded up, came and lived with me, and was living with me when he met Andrea. And but yeah, he was wrangling dudes, and he had an outstanding outlook on things. First time he'd ever wrangled dudes, and you hear all these bow-legged guys say, "Oh my God, I'd never wrangle dudes." Larry told him, he said, next time I hear somebody say that, he said, I'm going to tell him, you just keep your punchy ass in the brush. He said, man, there's good-looking girls everywhere. They give me tips at the end of the day. He said, ain't not a thing wrong with this. Larry was a good man to live with me for a long time.
You got any good stories? I'm sure they abound, but do you have any one or two you might be willing to share from those days?
Larry was a prankster, and a good one. And him and I together didn't do well, because if I wasn't thinking of something, he was, and so we were constantly, everybody was watching their whole card there when Larry was living with me. One of the funnest things I ever did, our boss, Ron Clayton, who is one of my great friends, I talk to him weekly. When he was putting these dude rides out, he would call they'd get them all around, and he gave this safety speech. And if there was some good-looking gal there, well, he'd usually have them sitting up on the fence beside him. Now, he was a happily married man, but the biggest flirt you ever saw. And so there was an attractive young lady come in there one time, and Larry McWhorter was there. And so Ron, he's kind of flirting. He told her, he says, you've got the prettiest blue eyes. That was all he said, or that's all I heard about. Anyway, the dude went, Larry's telling me this story. So we fabricated this whole deal and had another gal write a letter to him. saying, I've thought of nothing but you and this, and we didn't know this gal's name, so we just signed it Blue Eyes, or had this gal sign. And then she was leaving and said, you need to mail this from, I don't remember, Phoenix or somewhere, Las Vegas, wherever she was going. And, Ron gets this letter in the mail. And this letter is a little bit racy. And man alive, I mean, he said, holy cow, she's coming up here. And you guys go up to the Bright Angel Bar, you meet her, you tell her I'm happily married, I'm a Bible thumper, and he was just... And we were able to keep this going for quite a while before he finally figured out that Larry and I had set him up. And we paid for it, but we knew we were going to. But there were a number of different things like that. We had a lot of fun.
Like Rowdy Mitchell, who was my guest on the past 2 episodes, Ross Knox was writing and reciting cowboy poetry long before the first gathering in Elko. In fact, he and Rowdy were friends and shared poems with each other back in those days. I asked Ross how he first got into the poetry.
We were talking about this a couple of weeks ago in Heber City, Utah. When I was 21, which was 40 years ago, I would go to town being Elko at that time because I was back in northern Arizona, or northern Nevada. And at that time, the only 2 people I knew were me and Rowdy Mitchell doing it. So Rowdy was working at the 2U Ranch south of Elko, and he had a new baby on the ground, or a little boy on the ground, and one coming, and he was broke, man. I mean, so he couldn't, they didn't go to town, they didn't do anything. Any extra money they had, he made shoeing horses. So I'd get sick of partying, and I'd pick up some beer, and I would go see Rowdy, and we'd sit at his kitchen table and tell poems to each other. And like I said, that was, I think, 8 or 9 years before the first cowboy poetry gathering. And because, like I said, at that time, it was just me and him. I did not know one other soul that was writing anything or doing anything. So, yeah, I've been doing it a while.
How did that happen? Did you hear some other guys reciting poems, or?
No. One guy named Fritz Merrick, who started a bunch of colts all through northern Nevada. Everybody loved to hire Fritz. And he had a bad speech impediment. He was hair-lipped. You couldn't hardly understand him. Whale of a hand with a horse. But if he'd get to drinking, of course, then he was a little easier to understand, too. I don't know why, because I'm a harder to understand, I believe. But anyway, then he would tell some poems. But for me, I started out of boredom, no other reason. I'd be stuck in a cow camp somewhere, and I had nothing better to do, and I would sit down and start writing. And so I wrote a lot. Before I started writing for the public, I had untold amount of poems that I never do today. Some of them I'd like to go back and rewrite. But in fact, Rowdy and I were talking about that in Heber City, on the big stage there in Heber City. I asked the crowd, I said, y'all wonder what we all sounded like before we were so polished? And I'd gone out to see Rowdy one time, and they were leaving for Colorado the next day, going to Mike Martin's wedding, Mike and Mickey. And they said, come go with us. Well, I was broke. I'd been in Elko for a few days, and I had a job to go to, and they said, it's all right. Come on anyway. I called the ranch I was going to, said, I ain't going to make it. We're headed to Colorado, and everybody's got wedding gifts. I have nothing. So I wrote a poem called Getting Put in Double Harness, and wrote it on the way to La Junta, Colorado. And we got there to the Wine Cup Ranch. You know, all ranches do their own butchering, so I found some meat packing paper, And we put lines, and we printed this out on this meatpacking plate paper. I colored it in with brown shoe polish, went to the barn, found some old barn wood and framed it and gave it to him for their wedding. And I saw Mike and Mickey a few years ago, and they said that was the only thing they still had from their wedding was that poem that I wrote. And that's how it all kind of got started for me, just to sit down and write. I love to read and love to write, and I never had a TV.
How'd you hear about the first poetry gathering? You were there for the very first one, right?
I was there. I've been to every one except one. And Hal Cannon, who started this whole deal, as you know, I don't remember now how he kind of got started. He might have heard Rowdy. Rowdy was a little more out there as far as telling poems than I was. You know, if Rowdy'd have a couple of drinks, heck, he'd tell poems to anybody in the bar. And I was a lot more private. I was pretty backwards and shy. And I think Hal probably got with Rowdy. I will have to ask him. But anyway, but Hal put the word out to folklorists everywhere. And he got a hold of a folklorist in Prescott named Warren Miller. And at the time, I was in Seligman, Arizona, probably still at the Double O Ranch. I don't recall right now. I no longer remember how Warren got my name, but he did, and he tracked me down, and that's where it all started for me. I told him some poems, and Warren was smart. You know, he wanted me to. I met him in Seligman, and well, I can't sit in a motel room and tell poems. Not then. I can now, but he says, let's go to the Black Cat Bar and get a beer. Smart man, you know. Well, after a couple of beers, you betcha, let's get in the corner and I'll tell you some poems. You know, then that's how it all started for me.
What did you think when you heard there's going to be an event called the Cowboy Poetry Gathering and they wanted you to come?
I thought, who in the hell came up with an idea like this? And when I got there to the first one, I was shocked at the amount of guys there that I knew, a number of them that I'd worked with, that I had no idea had ever written anything or ever knew anything. I'd say, what are you doing? I'd, they asked me to come tell a poem. Yeah. And it shocked me. It shocked me. Because like I said, to my knowledge, it's just me and Rowdy. We were it.
Ross Knox is a fine poet, and in the 1980s he wrote a song with Canadian cowboy singer Ian Tyson called I Outgrew the Wagon. The song became the title cut to Ian Tyson's 1987 album, which was a follow-up to his groundbreaking cowboy album, Cowboyography. I've always loved that song and was curious how Ross and Ian came to write it.
It was somewhere after the second poetry gathering, and Ian and I had become friends. And Ian was riding a lot of cutting horses at that time. So he invited me to Canada, and I went to his place. I stayed with him for a while up there, and we were riding cutting horses and just having fun. He had a ranch at the time. We'd go check cows. Well, we got up one morning, and boy, it was way cold. So it was tapping down there a little below zero, I believe. And Ian said, man, he said, it's too cold to cut cows. He said, let's go write a song. And he had a cabin he called his Will James cabin. And it was out on the ranch. And so we're driving out there. It took about 25 minutes, and we're talking back and forth on what we want to write about. And I'd made a comment about being, you know, I was always in the spring, always the first one with my bedroll rolled and in the wagon. I was ready to go in the spring, and by the time fall rolled around, I was so sick of that teepee and bedroll. And we were talking about that, and Tyson says, that's it. That's going to be the song right there. And we wrote it that afternoon. And when we first wrote it, I can't hear it in my head. We're sitting writing, and so without hearing the music, and I told him, I said, I didn't much care for it. And he said, no. He said, this is going to work. He said, trust me on this. Well, once he got music to it, I liked it a lot better. And about the third residual check I got, I liked it real good. But it was. But that's how that all came about. Was just going up and staying with him. We always talked about writing another one. We just never got to it. I've been back up there, but there was always other people around. We just never got a chance to sit down and do it. But I would have enjoyed it. I was honored, and gosh, like I said, he named an album after it. And I was very honored.
Ian Tyson and Tom Russell together wrote a song called Ross Knox.
They did.
Can you tell me about the story behind that?
Tom's my friend too, and Ian and Tom and I have had way more fun than the law allows, but that's an entirely different story. Now, what prompted that song, when I left Grand Canyon, I left because the government hired me away to go to Saguaro National Park and pack. And by then I was beat up pretty bad there at the canyon, and this was a pretty laid back job. And I thought, you know what, it's time to make a move. So I went down there, and it was good. It was really good. But they'd had a couple of wrecks with volunteers. They've got a lot of horseback volunteers, and although they're not on the payroll, if they're signed up as a volunteer and they're in the park and they get hurt, the government still has to pay the doctor bills. So the safety officer, who is a friend of mine, I liked him, but his job is to come up with things to keep, safety as much as he can. And so without consulting me, he just passed a law in that particular park. Anybody horseback in the park had to wear a riding helmet. Well, they signed off on this before they ever came to me. Well, then they came to me and I said, no, it's not happening. And they said, and Jay Grass was this safety officer's name, a good guy, friend of mine. We get together and drink beer. He felt terrible, but superintendent's already signed off on it. And he said, there's not a thing I can do now. I said, you know what? I'm not doing it. So I quit. And I told him, I said, the only person you're going to find that'll wear a helmet is somebody that needs a helmet. And sure enough, they hired a guy, I know him. And he hadn't been there any time at all, got in a wreck coming off the mountain, tried to bail off, which is the worst thing you can do. Best thing is just try to ride things through. And it ain't easy to do. But he got scared, tried to bail off, and broke both arms. But and then the next guy they got in another wreck, and so they have since done away with that rule for the packer. Everybody else has the volunteers, the rangers. I believe everybody else has to wear them, but they've got rid of it. But of course, by then I was gone. I was in Yosemite packing there.
Long before I met Ross Knox, I'd seen a picture of him taken by the great photographer Kurt Markus. The picture is somewhat iconic and shows a younger Ross Knox with a couple of other cowboys posing in a bar. I've always wondered what the story was behind that picture. I want to find a picture. How I got it pulled up here. This is kind of a iconic photograph that Kurt Markus
yes, it
took.
is.
I'm looking at a book here called Buckaroo, and there's a picture of you and two other fellas.
Jerry Souza and Randy Everett.
Yep. sitting in a bar somewhere in Nevada. I've always loved that photograph, and I'd seen this long before I ever met you.
Yeah.
And I was just curious how that came about and if there's any kind of a story behind that.
Yeah, it's a great one, actually. That picture, the first book it came out in, of course, was After Barbed Wire. And Kurt that's when Kurt was co-editor for Western Horseman magazine. He was traveling around to a lot of ranches. And Kurt and I became friends. I was around him a whole lot. Well, he came to spend New Year's with me. I was running the cows at the Wine Cup Ranch north of Wells, Nevada. Sierra Land and Cattle Company had bought 2 ranches. They bought the Wine Cup and the Gamble Ranch, and they combined them. They bordered each other anyway. So Kurt comes to spend New Year's with me, and we decided we were going to go over and pick up Jerry Souza and Randy Everett, who we all know each other. So our world is not a real big world. And we ended up New Year's Eve at the Cowboy Bar in Montello. And actually, we ended up at a dance New Year's Eve. And everybody got a little tuned up there. Well, my wife and I, we ducked out and headed back to the ranch, but Kurt was wanting to stay. And he was riding with me, and it was a miserably cold winter, and I was a little concerned because he'd had a good bit to drink. And I always wanted to stay with Jerry and Randy. Well, they've found a couple of gals that seemed pretty interested. And I told him, I said, but he decided to stay. So the next morning, I head back into town to see if I can track those guys down. I found Randy and Jerry and no Kurt. I thought, man, he'd laid up in a snowbank somewhere. He wasn't. He'd found a motel that had an unlocked room and just slept in there. Well, we decided we'd go to the Cowboy Bar and have one to heal up on. And about 3 hours later, we're sitting there playing pool, feeling no pain, and the 3 of us were standing there at the bar in that picture, and Kurt says, "Stay right there. I got to get this picture." I had a Blazer at the time, and he had his camera out there. So he comes back in with his camera, but by now, he's already pretty tuned up again, and every time he'd raise the camera, he'd lose his balance. He had to prop himself up against the jukebox to take that picture. And turned out to be one of the most famous cowboy pictures he ever took. That picture's it's in Heathrow Airport. It's that thing's hanging all over the country. But yeah, all three models and the photographer were pretty tuned up when that picture was taken.
Singer-songwriter Tom Russell recently published a book of essays about the West entitled Ceremonies of the Horseman. It includes an essay about Ross called Muleteer on the Edge of the World. I read the following quote from that essay to Ross and asked him to respond. Here's what Tom Russell had to say. Ross Knox has been helicoptered out of the Grand Canyon 3 times. He's nearly died on a canyon trail with a fully loaded mule on top of him. He died on a heart-lung machine and came back to life. He's heard the angels sing Streets of Laredo and Bury Me Not on the Lone Prairie. He's harmonized with them. One morning, I thought Ross was dying on his knees in my pecan orchard after a rough and rowdy night in Juarez with myself and the great cowboy songster Ian Tyson. Near death is Ross Knox's street address.
That's great. That's too funny. Are you asking me about Juarez? Is that the direction we're going here?
Well, that would probably be a great story if that's what you got to tell.
I was at the canyon, and Tyson was down at the Gray Ranch in southern New Mexico, just visiting. He liked to come down there to southern Arizona and southern New Mexico. So he was down there with Kip Callahan, Richard Moore, Kip Callahan. And he calls me up. up the canyon. He says, "Come get me." And so I had some time off coming. So I drove down there, and to make a long story short, I knew he wanted to talk. He said, "Let's go to Lordsburg, get something to eat." I said, "Okay." So we're driving to Lordsburg. I'm just waiting. He's got something to say, and I don't know what it is. And about the time we're pulling into Lordsburg, he says, "Oh, heck," he said, "let's go see Russell." Well, Tom lived in El Paso, or Canutillo, which, is right out, it's the same thing. And so we headed to El Paso. And we get to Tom's place, and immediately we start drinking. And it's kind of late in the day, and finally Tyson staggers off to bed. Tom and I are sitting up there talking, and Tyson's clear. Tom has a big rambling house there. He did have. He sold it and since moved. But from the back of the house, Tyson hollers out, "Tom, sing me to sleep." Tom had a guitar sitting there in a corner in the dining room, so he picks it up and he'd sing 2 or 3 songs. "You asleep yet?" "No, not yet." But third time he asked, nothing. So he puts down the guitar, and we stayed up a while longer just talking. Well, the next day, next evening, we decide to go to Juarez. Now, I've been to Juarez before, and it never impressed me very damn much. But Tom knows where to go. And so we get down there, and dang, there's a good bit higher class part of Juarez than I ever knew existed. And we end up in this place down there, and it's pretty nice, pretty fancy. And the lady that's on the floor, she owns the place, and I have no idea what her name. I haven't thought of it in years. But she comes out, she's in a long gown. I mean, this is a pretty high-class place. And she kind of likes Tom. And so she sits down there with us, and she's wearing a pair of heeled slippers, about 1.5 inch high heel. Tom reaches down, and he takes one of those slippers off, and he fills it full of wine. And me and Tom and Tyson are passing that around, and we're drinking wine out of her slipper. She loves it. She's laughed. And anytime it was empty, Tom would just set it on the table. She never put it back on all night long. Pretty quick, Tom would fill that son of a gun up and pass it around, and we'd drink. So, yeah. Well, anyway, I'm not sure how deep to get into this story, and I'm not sure where this whole thing's going, so I'm not going to get... We left and headed back to Tom's, and Tom said, "I wonder if I called her. Her name might have been Catherine. So I wonder if I called Catherine, if I could get her to come over." So I said, "Hey, call her." So he calls her, she answers, and he said, "I was wondering if you'd be interested in coming over and having a few drinks with us." She says, "I'm right behind you." She'd followed us right back across the border. And we'll end this story here and now. But, yeah, we had a good time, And Tom, like Tyson, is a lot of fun to be around. Tom and I have had so much fun together.
Well, you got a poem in you might recite to kind of wrap this deal up for us?
Sure I do. What would you like to hear, Andy?
I'd like to hear Memories.
Memories. I wrote this poem, as we started into this little deal. I was telling you I went to the canyon because I knew I was going to have an open heart surgery. Well, I had that surgery, and I was in good shape, and things were just fine, but I got a staph infection. And it ate the sutures up on that new valve that they just put in. And I was way closer to being dead than alive. They put me back in the hospital, but they couldn't operate. They couldn't open me up because they couldn't get that staph infection under control. And so I'm laying in a hospital in Phoenix. They put the paddles on me twice in one day. there. I mean, I was gone. And this surgeon, Dr. Hessel, came in. And he says, Ross, he said, if we don't operate tomorrow, you're going to die. And I said, well, good, because I don't want to lay here anymore. I was in my early 40s. I was a young man. And he said, I can't get that staph infection under control. And he said, as soon as I crack your chest, he said, it's going to run wild, and I can't get you off the table. He said, I can't make it any plainer than that. I said, hey, do what you can do. And then, well, here I sit. So there's no medical explanation for it. They cracked my chest open, staph infection was gone. Nobody knows why. We all have our own beliefs. But I was a long time recuperating from that. I was a long time. And so it gave me a lot of time to reflect and time to write. And it was during that time that I wrote this poem called Memories. Well, you sit in your chair and you stare at the wall and you relive the days when you rode proud and tall while making the big drives, rope and brand, and just practice the art of making a hand. You was just a kid when you left your home and headed north to the Yellowstone, to those high mountain meadows in a pristine land that's yet to be ruined by human hand. And it still brings a smile when you relive the ride on a moonlit night across the Great Divide, with the northern lights sparkling like diamonds and jewels, just you and God and a string of mules. You made your camp up on Two Ocean Creek. You let the sound of the water sing you to sleep. And those high desert ranches on the Nevada range, where for the last 100 years there's been damned little change. At night, round the chuck wagon, you wish folks could see that you and the Mustang, the only thing left that's free. From a hilltop you'd stare at the vast expanses. Seemed you could trot forever and hit no fences. With no time clock or desk, each day we'd thank God that we're not a slave to the urban mob. Yes, you'd chosen to ride a trail seldom traveled, little knowing how fast it can all come unraveled. Remember the winter of '73? It was the beginning of the end for men like me. You were on top of the world, and then overnight, the cow market dropped clear out of sight. And it just kept getting worse with each passing day till a cow wasn't hardly worth giving away. You'd spent your whole life keeping a tradition alive. Now each day's a constant battle to just try and survive. But though the cost of grass keeps going up and cow prices keep falling, being a cowboy's still the highest calling. Well, now you're a prisoner to a chair that has wheels, but you still remember the way that it feels to step across a good horse, a custom-made saddle, and the thrill of running Mustangs or tying down wild cattle. For the last 40 years, you've had the same loving wife. There's not much you'd change about your life. But when the memories come calling, you still can't help but pray, Lord, please make me a cowboy again for a day.
That's beautiful.
Thanks, Andy. I appreciate it.
Thanks for sharing some stories with me,
Absolutely. It's been a great time for me. You're a good friend, and I don't take that for granted.
All right, folks, that's it for this episode. Thank you to Ross Knox for taking the time to visit with me. You can find out more about Ross at cowboypoetry.com/Ross Knox. You can find out more about me and this show at andyhedges.com/cowboycrossroads. If you'd like to help me keep this show going, you can make a donation on the website, or you can rate the show on iTunes and leave a review, and subscribe so that you'll never miss an episode. If you'd like to contact me with comments or questions, please email Andy at andyhedges.com. Thank you for listening to Cowboy Crossroads.